When Robert Patterson encountered a homeless man on the street, he had no idea that this was his long-lost brother, whose life had been destroyed by social injustice and betrayal. Reconnecting with him would reveal terrifying secrets that would shake the foundations of their family and society. What happens next will shock even the most jaded. But let's start at the beginning. The morning in New York promised to be just like any other. Robert Patterson walked down the bustling street toward his office, listening to the familiar rhythm of the big city. The noise of cars, the hum of voices, and the footsteps of countless people merged into a single urban symphony, one that Robert had long since stopped paying attention to. His thoughts were consumed with upcoming meetings, deals, and a list of tasks swirling in his mind for the day. But as he passed a cafe on the corner of 42nd Street, something made him stop. Near the sidewalk, blending into the background of noise and chaos, sat a homeless man. He was filthy, his clothes hung in rags, and his skin was weathered from the long days spent on the streets. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, were lifeless, as if this man had long lost faith in himself and in others. For a brief moment, those eyes met Robert's, and something in that gaze made him slow his pace. But only for a moment. As a man used to solving problems methodically and with cold precision, Robert instinctively turned away. He had long developed an immunity to such situations. "Why should I stop my life for someone else's problems?" he mused, continuing on his way. He was someone who had built himself up from nothing, escaping a small-town life, navigating ups and downs. He didn't believe in pity, convinced that everyone must be responsible for their own life and mistakes. Yet, this thought didn't bring him relief. In fact, the further he walked, the heavier his heart felt. Something inside him protested against this indifference, against simply walking by. And suddenly, as if in a trance, the image of his brother, Michael, flashed in his mind. Michael. How many years had passed since he disappeared? Robert couldn't quite remember. Michael had been only 2 years older than him, and in their childhood, they were like two inseparable friends. His brother had always been the adventurous one, ready for any wild scheme, while Robert often played the role of the rational one, trying to protect Michael from taking too many risks. They were like day and night, Michael with his reckless energy, and Robert, always calculating and calm. Nonetheless, they complemented each other, two halves of a whole. But everything changed when Michael fell in with the wrong crowd. It was a turbulent time, filled with too many temptations and too few mentors. Michael, never one to shy away from a gamble, quickly found himself caught up in a whirlwind of late-night parties, shady deals, and constant run-ins with the law. Robert had desperately tried to pull his brother back, but his efforts were in vain. Every time he tried to talk to Michael, his brother would simply brush him off, assuring him that everything was under control. And then, one day, Michael disappeared. It was an ordinary day, and no one expected him to just leave. No note, no call, no trace. Robert remembered searching for him, unable to eat or sleep for weeks, waiting for any word. But nothing came. Time passed, and Michael simply vanished into the vast world. The memories flooded back so suddenly and intensely that Robert stopped in the middle of the street. His heart tightened, and he felt an old pain rise in his chest. The pain of loss, the pain of guilt. He had always blamed himself for not being able to help Michael when he needed it most. Now, his life was filled with success and money, but the memories of his brother were a shadow that always hung over him. Returning to his office, Robert found that he couldn't focus on his work. Usually, sitting at his massive wooden desk, he easily immersed himself in documents and numbers, but today was different. Every thought kept returning to that homeless man. Who was he? How did he end up on the streets? Could Michael have become just like that? Lost among millions of faces, abandoned and forgotten? The guilt continued to grow, and Robert couldn't shake the thought. What if Michael is living like this right now? Could he be nearby, in this same city, sitting on some sidewalk, with empty eyes and a hope long extinguished? The question tormented him, and despite his efforts to get back to work, Robert realized that his day had changed. Throughout the day, the anxiety didn't leave Robert. He tried to get back to his work, hold meetings, sign documents, but every thought returned to that morning encounter with the homeless man. The image of that man had firmly lodged in his mind, and a strange sense of guilt gnawed at him from within. The questions wouldn't let go. Who was he, this homeless man? How did he end up on the streets? And why had that brief look exchanged on the street left such a deep impression on Robert's heart? When the workday came to an end, instead of going home as he usually did, Robert made an unexpected decision. He decided to walk the same route where he had seen the homeless man in the morning. It was almost an impulsive decision, driven by the worry that had been building up inside him all day. He felt like he had to do something, at least try to understand why this person had affected him so much. The sun had already begun to dip below the horizon when Robert stepped outside. The streets of New York were still alive with activity, despite the approaching evening. Crowds of people rushed about, and amidst this chaos, Robert saw him again. The same homeless man sitting on the sidewalk. The man was still there, in the same spot, with the same tired look. This time, Robert didn't turn away and walk on. He slowed down and stepped closer. Stopping in front of the homeless man, Robert hesitated for a moment, but then, gathering his resolve, he reached into his pocket for his wallet. "Here, take this," he said, handing the man some bills. This time, he wanted to help, even if only in a material way, just to ease this stranger's burden. But instead of gratitude, the homeless man raised his eyes and shook his head. "I don't need money," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. Robert froze. He hadn't expected this response. Usually people on the street accepted any handouts gratefully, but this man was different. There was something more in his gaze, something that instantly caught Robert's attention. "What I really need," the homeless man continued, "is a second chance." Those words echoed in Robert's head. A second chance. They touched something deep inside him, stirring memories he had tried to bury for many years. He looked at the homeless man more closely, studying his face. Was there something familiar in those features? Could this man be someone he once knew? "You remind me of someone," Robert finally said, his voice wavering, as if he wasn't sure if he should continue the thought. The homeless man smirked, but there was no malice or sarcasm in his expression, only the exhaustion that had built up over years of life on the streets. "Interesting," the man replied, his voice trembling slightly. Robert froze, feeling a chill run down his spine. That voice. There was something very familiar in it. The voice of his brother, Michael, whom he hadn't heard in so many years. Robert's heart began to race. He couldn't believe it was possible, but something deep within him told him that this wasn't just a coincidence. Could this really be his brother? The same Michael who had disappeared all those years ago, whom he had searched for, whom he had never stopped thinking about. These thoughts swirled in Robert's mind and he didn't know how to react. Time seemed to slow down. Robert sat on the sidewalk next to the homeless man, feeling the tension between them grow with each passing second. It felt as if everything around them had suddenly quieted. The cars, the people, the city's noise, all dissolved, leaving only the two of them in this strange but important moment. Robert couldn't take his eyes off the man sitting next to him. His thoughts were spinning wildly. Could this really be his brother? Could it truly be that Michael, his Michael, was now sitting before him in such a miserable situation? Robert's heart pounded in his chest, and his palms were sweating from the anxiety. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. The words he needed to say were stuck in his throat. He was afraid to speak them aloud, afraid of what the answer might be. But something inside urged him. You have to ask. You have to know the truth. Finally, unable to bear the agonizing silence any longer, Robert whispered, "Michael?" His voice was barely audible, but those words were enough to change everything. The homeless man he had just met raised his eyes, and while his face remained expressionless, his eyes spoke volumes. In them, Robert saw so much pain and regret that his heart tightened. "Yes, it's me," Michael said, his voice trembling. Those 3 words instantly shattered Robert's world. He couldn't believe his ears. couldn't believe that the man before him was truly his brother, the person he had searched for, mourned, and thought about for so many years. Everything inside Robert collapsed. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment, sending him tumbling into the void. He closed his eyes, trying to comprehend what was happening. His brother, the very person he once knew, was sitting in front of him, trapped in poverty, abandoned, and left to fend for himself. "How? How did this happen?" Robert barely whispered, still staring at Michael, unable to believe his own eyes. Michael took a heavy breath, as if gathering the strength to tell the story of his life, a story he had hidden for all these years. "I ran away because I thought I could change everything, start fresh. But I was wrong. You were right when you warned me that this life would destroy me. But I didn't want to listen to you then." His voice was hollow, full of regret and pain. He recounted how it had all begun with bad decisions, getting involved with the wrong people, how his life spiraled into a vortex of crime from which there was no escape. He had tried to break free, but it only pulled him in deeper. "I thought I could handle it, that I could find my way, but it got out of control. I was arrested, served time in prison, then got out, but there was nothing left. I lost everything, my job, my friends, my home. And eventually, I ended up on the streets, like so many others." Robert listened, not interrupting his brother. He was shocked, devastated. All this time, all these years, he had thought that Michael might be dead, but in reality, his brother had been living on the streets, just trying to survive. Michael continued, explaining how ashamed he was of everything that had happened. He couldn't come home, couldn't face the family, knowing that he had disappointed them. "I was afraid you wouldn't take me back, that to you, I was nobody. I was sure I didn't deserve forgiveness," Michael added quietly, lowering his head. Those words cut Robert to the core. He couldn't believe that his brother, the person who had once meant everything to him, had thought the family would reject him. Robert sat silently, listening as Michael recounted the years of pain and suffering, how he ended up homeless, and how many times he thought about returning home, but was always too afraid that no one would accept him. Robert was stunned, but more than that, a deep sense of guilt began to rise within him. He realized that he had been consumed by his own affairs, his success, and hadn't searched for Michael as relentlessly as he could have. Instead of using his influence and resources to find his brother, he had allowed himself to believe that Michael was gone for good. And now, here he was, the very person he had lost so long ago, his brother, who had spent years in the shadows, forgotten by everyone, including him. The silence between them felt unbearable. Robert felt a lump forming in his throat. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to express the overwhelming mix of emotions that were flooding him. There was guilt for not searching for Michael, regret for the lost years, and sorrow for how their lives had diverged so drastically. He, a successful businessman living in luxury, and his brother, who had lost everything and ended up on the streets. In that moment, Robert realized that all his wealth, his successful career, and his money meant nothing compared to family. All those years he had spent building his fortune and career suddenly felt empty and meaningless. What mattered most now was that his brother was sitting in front of him, and they had a chance to rebuild what had been broken, a chance that couldn't be wasted. He finally broke the silence. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Michael, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I should have looked for you. I should have tried to help you sooner." Michael looked up, his eyes filled with pain, but also a spark of hope. He shook his head. "Don't blame yourself, Robert. I chose this path. It's my fault I ended up here." He paused, as if searching for the right words to express his feelings. "But I never thought you'd be happy to see me. I was sure I had disappeared from your lives, like I didn't matter anymore." Those words struck Robert deeply. His brother, whom he loved and had thought about so often, believed that the family no longer cared about him. This realization hurt Robert more than he had expected. He couldn't let Michael continue living with that thought. Robert took a deep breath, summoning his courage. "Let's go home," he said softly but firmly, looking directly into his brother's eyes. Michael looked at him with disbelief, as if he couldn't believe this was real. "I'll help you. We can start over together," Robert continued, his voice filled with determination. Michael sat silently, processing what he had just heard. It was clear he was hesitant. Past wounds, fears, and disappointments that had built up over the years held him back from immediately agreeing. But when he looked into his brother's eyes, he saw more than sympathy. He saw genuine care, a sincere desire to help. It was something Michael hadn't seen or felt in a long time. And in that moment, he realized Robert was telling the truth. This was a chance he couldn't pass up, even if his heart was still torn with doubts. He nodded, trying to hide the emotions bubbling up inside him. Robert, seeing the gesture, exhaled in relief, knowing they had taken the first step toward mending their relationship. For both of them, it was a new chance. A chance to forget the past and start a new chapter in their lives. They stood up from the sidewalk and walked together. Robert walked beside his brother, and in his heart, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling that everything could be different now. When they reached the car, Robert opened the door, inviting Michael to get in. They drove through the evening streets of New York to Robert's luxurious home. But now it felt like more than just a symbol of his success. It was a place where he could offer Michael a new home, a new life, and restore their broken family ties. The story ended with the brothers stepping across the threshold of the house, leaving behind all the sorrows and mistakes of the past. It was a new beginning for both of them.